You ready back there, Colin? No, I guess he's not.
Yes, you just say yes.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'm Arthur Rathburn, and some of you have seen me here before a couple of years ago. Oh, I've got to learn. I got to be by this thing. I never use these things. I got my start in extension service, which meant that I gave most of my talks in barns and and out in fields and all those things. So we never had these fancy things like this. And so I still did very big crowds without it. Well, tonight we're going to be talking about my latest book, which is To a Better Place. Have you wondered sometimes, in looking back at your history and your ancestry, why the heck did they come to this country? Whether it was just a few years ago, or it may have been like my family came back in the 1600s. Well, to me, I've always wondered why people go to a better place. Can you imagine, someone's finally got a woman's finally got the house all fixed up, the garden's great, and the kids are in school and everything's good, and along comes the man and says, I think we ought to go to a better place. Well, that's happened to me. I'm living now in, I think, my 13th home. So I moved to a lot of better places. My family there, Christine is over here, and she's gone through almost all of them. How many moves? Yeah, quite a few moves. Well, when I started looking at writing this book, I did it, really it was going to be my second book. Turned out to be my ninth, but it was going to be my second book, so I outlined it I always thought, well, I'll take a family from England, and I'll bring them over to the New England area, and I'll follow that family and eventually follow, like one of my favorite writers, Mishner, kind of Mishner style. Has the family made America? To kind of show how individuals had a big impact on this country. Well, when I got to working on the book and doing the research, I kept running across my family name. I had no idea about my ancestry at all. And as I got into it and I kept finding this, I got on the internet and made an inquiry, does anybody know anything about the Rathburns? Well, there was a guy in Kentucky got a hold of me. He says, well, my name's Rathbone, and the name's changed over the years. Originally it was Rathbone, then it became Rathbun, and then Rathburn, and they're all three used today. In fact, the family is very large. It's at one time was the largest family organization in the United States, which surprised me because it's an unusual name. Those of you who are named Smith and Miller, good luck on finding what your connection is through the years. But my family all started from two people coming over here. So when I started doing the book, when I laid it out, there was a couple things I wanted to talk about in New England. Why did they come? Well, we know about the religious part. The first one's over, the Pilgrims. Remember, the Pilgrims were in England first, and they were asked to leave, and so they went to Holland, and in Holland they were asked to leave, and they came back to the king, and they say, could we go to the New World? Would you give us a charter? And they came over. And then other groups, pressure began to get onto them that the English wanted them out. Why? Mostly because they didn't pay tithes. And remember, it was the church was a state church, first of all, so the government had a monetary stake. Plus, the people were upset in England because these people had the gall to go around and call everyone thee and thou. Well, you use those terms in England, but you only used them for lower people than you. You wouldn't dare go to someone in a higher social status and say thee. And so that was causing a little problems. So we had the religious part. I also knew that there was not a lot of opportunity there. England at that time had a rule of primogeniture. Primogeniture meant that only the oldest son got everything in the inheritance. So that meant a second son and those down the line would work for his older brother the rest of his life, because there were not a lot of jobs. So on those two bases, I started going. And then I found out there was another big reason. They were cold. All the trees were gone, pretty much. If you see pictures from England now, they're still it's pretty bare. And the trees were gone, and the coal, they had lots of coal, but that was for the use by the industry and the rich. And so that left peat. Not everybody had peat available, and those that it did, it was kind of a tough thing to go harvest it, and it's not an easy process to live using peat. So they were cold. And so at the time, there were people coming around England, pilgrims, first of all, who were scouting for more people to come to the New World. And in the book, you'll find some actual quotes from those people. I mean, oh boy, we got streams that the fish you can walk across. There are so many ducks that you just shoot in the air and you get 50. And don't ever worry again about being cold, because there are trees and all kinds of trees everywhere. And so if you were a second son, in this case, a boy from a shoemaker in a little tiny shoemaker shop, knowing that the rest of your life you're going to work for your brother, and you find out that this guy is coming along and speaking, you'll find that he could not go just listen, because the church itself was so anti against Puritans. They called the word Puritan came through there were more than one group. The Pilgrims were actually Puritans, but they didn't use the name. And the Quakers were known by many as Puritan, but they didn't use the name. And there were other groups. But the biggest group, called Puritan, came out during the Cromwell years, when King Charles was executed and the Cromwells took over, and they had it kind of strong. But when they got rid of the Cromwellians and King Charles II came on, then these people needed out of there. They needed to go. So here was a guy that had to come over, and you're going to find out. I start the book a little bit strange for some of you, because I start with a couple in bed. Well, this is a history book. It's not some kind of wild modern story. But those couples in those days, remember, you're in a house with a stove in the front room only, and are you going to be a young teenage couple and court sitting there with mom and dad listening in? So they were allowed to go up into the bedroom and lie in bed, fully dressed, with a bundling board in between. Any of you heard of a bundling board? There's a few that have. The bundling board had a big sawtooth cut on it, and you were not to go across that bundling board, and you were fully dressed, and you were in bed with covers on, because it was cold. You had to leave the bedroom door open. And so when people, mom and dad, walked by, they casually walked by, they always had some reason to walk up and down the hall and look in on you. But then I was able, by that scene then, as you'll find out, I lay out why these people really wanted to come to the New World, because they were talking to themselves about the disappointments they had and all that. So these people were coming, they tried to become Quakers in a way, at least the 3 of the 4 that came over. Two of the 3 that came over together. 2 of them tried to become Quakers, but the Quakers could not get a charter to get over. And remember, you couldn't just go down and buy a ticket. You had to be member of a group. So you had to be in a chartered group, and those chartered groups were almost always religious oriented, especially in the northern part of the New World. And so they were just coming over, and you settled into community hall. So we have this thought that America was started on religious freedom. Was that religious freedom when these people came over in groups? Well, it was really the opposite. They didn't come over to have religious freedom. They came over to have the freedom to kick everyone else out of their community but their faith. So they were run by very can't even say the word, theocracy of the ministers and in the various areas and towns were very, very strong. Well, it turned out that my guy, John Rathbone, was not a Puritan. He was, in fact, in my research, he was the first one I could really identify who wasn't a Puritan. He came over, and he came over in a group because he came over as a hireling. He was working for someone. The only others that wouldn't have been would have been indentured servants. And that's an important thing for as you read this story. So now we got the political of the indentured servant. We got the religious problem, and we have trying to get along in this new environment. And so when they came, so that started the story going, and as I wrote it, those of you who've read some of my books know that I'm pretty strong on trying to get history into a story. I'm a believer that people don't read textbooks because they're boring. And so in school, they get turned off by history when they should be totally enthralled by history, because history is about us. It's about the way people feel and the way people react. So I try to write a story, and I think I can sum up how I did this in the very last sentence in the book. I leave you with just one thought. Please remember, this book is not designed to be a history textbook, but it does contain a lot of history. And so that's really what I was trying to do. But as I got writing it, I was shocked that I was writing so much about religion, because that wasn't my purpose when I went out. But the religion and political world were all one. So nothing was happening without the others. And so the groups that came over that had disagreements had great big problems. When the Quakers finally did come over, they were, sometimes they put holes in their tongues, cut their ears off in cases, took them downtown and whipped them. In fact, the first person, female, hung in the New England area, in the northern part of the country, was Mary Dyer, a Quaker. So it was pretty tough. And so some of them started moving out. And I'm sure you've heard of Roger Williams and Anne Hathaway. They were 2 Puritans that eventually moved south into the Rhode Island area. And they went down there mainly because of Anne Hathaway. She had the nerve to believe that women had a right to their own way to heaven too. Imagine that. What a thought. And she actually was teaching women. because on Thursday night, all the men went in for Bible study, and the women had to stay home and work. So she started teaching night courses on Thursday night to women, and some of the men heard from their wives what a wonderful speaker she was and teacher she was, and they started coming. And of course, then the Puritan ministers got a little upset and asked them to leave, and they fled to the south in Rhode Island. And in Rhode Island, they kind of didn't actually write it into their charter or anything, but it was a free colony religious-wise. Very, very early on, there were not only Puritans, but there were Anglicans, and there were actually Catholics, known as Papists then. There were Papists. There were even some Muslims, known as Turks then. And there were Quakers. And those who went out, like Anne Hathaway, her group eventually became Baptists. And Roger Williams' group eventually became Congregationalists. I always say that wrong, and she's always correcting me. My editor's in the back there. And so there were all these groups there. Well, somehow this guy finally, as you'll read, by chance, even though he was poor, and I forgot to mention one thing, he couldn't read and write. So here you have a guy who can't read and write, the wrong religion, doesn't have a lot of money, and he's stuck in a country where he's planning on building up and becoming a farmer. Shortly after he got there, Richard Mather, from the famous Mather tribe, the ministers who eventually came down and even sort of triggered the, even though they wasn't the priest, I mean the minister at the Salem witch trials, it was really pretty well pushed forward by the grandson of Richard Mather. Well, Richard Mather, right after they got there, said, and officially, and I have the whole church history from there, that no person who was not a member of that church, not a Puritan, but that church, could own land or run a business. Where else have we heard that in history? Quite a few times. That's one of the first things that you do when you start trying to control those people you don't like. So he was stuck. What's he going to do? Well, he had the luck to go to this island that you have a map over here. It's called Block Island. Block Island is 12 miles off the coast of Rhode Island, and it's not very big. It's about 10 miles from one end to the other, and there was no one living on it other than no people were there, because the others were these things called Native Americans, or Indians in those days, called them Indians. They weren't people. They were part of the wildlife in the minds of the people of that day, the Europeans. So they came into there, and there were 16 groups came. And that was to my fortune, because they divided this land up into 16 parcels. Actually 32. There were 16 here and 16 there, because this land is pretty hard to farm and to live on. And so they gave one parcel here and one parcel there. So they got it in that way. But this guy, even though he didn't have any money, really very little money, he managed to get a loan. They needed they needed two more, so they gave loans to two different people and made them partners. Well, he was fortunate, because after the first year, his partner quit, and he got the second parcel. And so he had really more land than anyone else, and being the poorest man on the island. But in the book, as you go through, you'll find out how some strange things happened because of them going down there. Politically, they did a strange thing. When they got there, they found out no one knew who Block Island really belonged to. Excuse me. Rhode Island colony says it's ours. Massachusetts colony says it's ours, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And so they both went to the King's Council and say, okay, who owns Block Island? And while the King's Council was making up their mind, they were told they have to make their own charter. So here's 16 people are going to make a charter. That's kind of like a constitution. You know, you're going to write the rules and regulations for that place, and that has to be accepted by the King's Council. Well, when they got there, the normal way to do it is you had a committee, normally appointed by the king, but in other cases appointed by the church. And in that committee, always the head of the committee was the minister. And so he ran the place. And how did that run up in New England? Now, if you wanted to sell her a cow, you couldn't just sell her a cow. You had to go to the church council and say, can I sell her a cow? And they not only would say yes or no, but they would tell you what price you were to charge. So this was, of course, to keep any arguments down in the community. That way it kept it really nice. Actually, the real reason was that by doing that, the church got tithes first. And so they were really setting their own tithes for every merchant type or trading agreement that went on in the colony. So these guys were down there at 16, and they said, okay, we got to have a charter. We have to elect a committee. So they were getting ready, well, how are we going to do this and this and that? And finally, one guy, and I'm pretty sure it was Rathbone, because he was sort of on the outs of it, political and religious-wise. He was kind of a different than the majority were. They all had attachments other places. And he said, golly, there's only 16 of us. Why don't we vote? Well, that sounds like a simple solution, but it hadn't been done before. People didn't really realize that common man could have a vote. And so they formed what I honestly believe was the first democracy in the New World. Now, of course, the Native Americans say they're the five tribes of the Iroquois Federation. They say they're the first democracy in America, and in many ways they were, and they're very strong influence that they had a big reason why our Constitution is written like it is. But they were really a federation. The people did not all vote, just their representatives that came to the Federation and voted. So they were more like a republic. But so here are these guys, they voted. So that was pretty new. And then it came down because there was a chunk of land right here that was called church land in the first thing. And everybody had the right to put their sheep out there, but they had to pay a rental fee for the land. And that land went into a pot in the church pot, so then when they could bring a minister to the island, they would have a way to pay him. So then they got in a big argument. What kind of minister? Well, the people from Rhode Island, some of them said, well, they have to be a Baptist because this is now Rhode Island. And others said, no, they have to be Congregationalists because that's what Roger Williams wanted. And, of course, in New England, they said got to be Puritan. But there were Quakers there. And there were also Scotch guys who had come to this world as indentured servants and now were free, and they were Presbyterian. So they were all in this argument. Somebody, the only one who was different or by himself and not with another group, was John. And I'm sure it was him that said, wait a minute, why don't we just write our charter and keep religion and political doings separate? So all of a sudden, here's this guy, can't read and write, has that kind of power to change that. And in fact, they liked it so well, when they finally were made part of, the king came back and they said, no, this island belongs to Rhode Island. Then they elected him to the Rhode Island Council, and he went over there, and they had to write a new charter because Charles had come and he wanted a new charter. And so they had to write a new charter. And guess what? If you read the language from what was written out here on this little island and what was written in Rhode Island and Newport at the council meeting, pretty much same words. The only thing I can really say is there was only one man who was in both places, and that was John, this guy who couldn't read and write. But by that time, he had gained some stature. And so he went there. They went on, of course, that language got put very strongly into their charter, Rhode Island, and again, it kind of shows up very much like that in the Articles of Confederation, and later into the Constitution. So could it even be possible that one person's idea, one person, carried out and made such an important step in our history? Well, I'm not sure John did it, but it makes a much better story if I make John do it, okay? And that's the way I write. Everyone in the book almost is a real person. And you'll find a lot of familiar names, big-time names. I know he was on councils with them, or I know he had business deals with them, and those kind of things. But I don't know exactly the things that happened between them. So I'll have to say I do make up a little bit now and then, you know, just a little bit. You know, let your imagination go. But I try to make everyone real in the book, even to the point when I had him land in the Bay of Massachusetts colony, that when he landed there, the people who picked him up the boat were real people, because I got their names out of the church records from the town that he was going to. And so I go to that kind of thing. I mean, I do try very much, so you know. You're going to find a lot of facts, little ones I go off and there, you know, like he becomes a trader and he trades, and one of the things he trades is in wampum. So I make a deal of telling you what wampum is, what the actual value. It did have a real value, surprised me. In the colonies, they had a set value for this wampum, for these beads, and so that was all set. So I kind of do those kind of things through the whole book all the way through. And I think when you read it, if you let yourself imagine how you living in a small community, what you could do. You know, you as an individual, one person, as Christine knows, in the state of Idaho, as one person who was not a legislator, who really had no stake in that, I ended up writing some legislation that was accepted and working there, because one person can move things along. And so that's part of what I'm trying to get out of the book. And I know there's a few of you who've read the book. Do you have any questions? Or I think you said you were armed with questions there. No, come on. Now, I hope you don't find too many errors in it. I got a really good editor. When I worked with other publishers, I had books clear full of errors. And so I took it over, and I still didn't have good editorial work, and so I had mistakes. So this time, I went through real hard. Well, we were real pleased, because my brother, who's my worth critic, called me and said, I didn't find a mistake. Oh, no, that couldn't be. And there's never been a book that's printed without mistakes. Unfortunately, last night, or Monday night, I guess it was, we were out to dinner, and the woman who had just read the book says, boy, I found a pretty bad error. And, well, you're going to find a pretty bad error in there. It's there, and so I can say that, I say it's, you know, like when the Afghans make an Afghan rug, they also always leave a mistake in there because it's important that God's the only one that can do things perfect. So you have to leave a mistake. So I probably have 2 or 3 or more in there, and it's just to prove that I in there. But I hope you enjoy from there. Yes, please. Actually, the woman who runs the museum on the island is distant. Her parents were connected into the Rathbones, and it's there. So when I was there, I got lucky because in the town itself, for years, the man who was the clerk in the town clerk in town was my grandfather, my 7th great grandfather, the son of John. He was the youngest son, the first one in the family that learned to read and write. And so I'm reading those kind. And I have a roll back there of some of the town notes that you might want to just unroll and look at. And you can see what you have to do when you research and go through this. If you think I make a couple mistakes, the old way of doing thing was you could spell the same word 3 times in the same paragraph. And some words, and they shortened a lot of words. They like to use short forms. If they meant which, they might just have W/. And you got to figure out which W they're talking about. And so those kind of things were going. And the other thing I got lucky was in the history of the island that was written, there were 2 of them. In one of them, they wanted people to know what life was like on the island, and they used the Rathbone family. So one whole chapter in the book was on the Rathbone family. So I had to start. When I got there, I found out that, in my estimation, they were wrong in some of the things they said. And so, for example, it says that when they landed up right here because they couldn't get through this neck right here because it was too shallow. Well, they landed here. Well, actually, they did land their cattle and things there because the wind was blowing and they couldn't get it in here. The wind was protected up here, nice beach up here, so they just threw the cattle overboard and let them swim in. Well, a couple of them didn't make it. They became shark feed. They decided to go to England instead, and so they lost a few. But there was no fresh water up here. This is all brackish water. Now, you're not gonna go camp and stay where there's not any fresh water. So, and they came out, and what you'll find out is a shallop, which is a small little boat. Have anybody ever been to the Mayflower? At the park next to the Mayflower is a shallop. And the Pilgrims brought a shallop over cut in half in not the Mayflower, but the other boat that was with them. And they reconstructed it there, and that's what they went up and down the coast from because they landed down at Cape Cod, and they went on up looking, and that's when they found Plymouth and Plymouth Rock and everything, and they came back up with a shallop and then brought there. So they had this smaller boat, the shallop. Well, in the history, it said they all came over in a shallop. While a shallop is about 30 feet long, and you're going to bring 16 people with all their, some of them had workers with them, and they had their livestock with them, and they had their household goods with them. That thing would have been stacked bigger than the boat that ran into the bridge in Baltimore last couple weeks ago, because you couldn't have got them in there. But that's what the history said. So I kind of tried to correct some of that, and I found that there was a fresh spring right about here. It's the only fresh spring I could find because this is all brackish, and up here these are fresh. Oh, excuse me, wrong side. This is a fresh lake down, be that one right there, called Fresh Pond, and there. But so I had them landing right there till they found their lands and everything. And also where they originally said they settled the land, this little bracket this part right here was the Rathbones. You may have seen a picture of a huge stone lighthouse. It's a great big heavy lighthouse. It was about to fall into the bay right here. And they jacked that thing up, put it on a railroad, and moved it several hundred yards in. That was on Rathbone land, that part there. Very, very rugged. This land, when they got there, they said you could walk across it without touching the dirt. It had that many stones. There's stones over, and when you go there, there are stone fences everywhere. Some of the fields are not much bigger than this room, with a 4-foot stone fence all the way around it. That's when they had to move them off the field. So they had an awful lot of work to do on that. So he got that land, but later he was given some more, and he formed right down here. Well, they said where his house was, and I went down there, and I said, no, you know, if you're a woman in those days, you've got to tend the garden, you got to keep the household, you got to tend the kids, and if you got a cow, you got to milk the cow and make the cream and the milk. Besides that, you didn't have anything to do. And so they're not going to have their garden a couple hundred yards away. They're going to have their garden right outside their door so they can do it all. So I had to find a place that had the possibility of a garden, had a possibility of the water. And so I kind of located it, and then I went back and did some research, and I found out that the road from the center road to their place was 1,000 feet long, and on it there were some stone gate posts. I was out there, and I all of a sudden saw some gate posts out in the middle of a field in a whole bunch of bramble, and I walked out there, and yes, they were gate posts. They had the rings in them to hold the gate and everything. So I followed that down. I saw a hill that looked like it had a road cut around it. So I told my wife, why don't you go around the other way and come in from where they said the house was, and I'll come in this way and see what happens. And I came down that road, and it ended up right where I thought the only garden plot in the whole area could be. Plus, there was a swale there that they could have dammed up. I found some evidence that there was a dam on it and everything. They are now hoping they can do some archaeology work there to figure out if there was a house of some kind there. So those are the kind of things you kind of do in laying out this thing and the time it takes. Now, it took me a long time to write the book because we did it 10 years. If you'll see inside the book, on the first page, no, I can't find it right now, but you'll find a picture of my late wife on there. She really got into this project, and we worked on it forever. And we were about ready to wrap it up when she got sick with cancer. And so they had that time of cancer and the time of grief and everything. And so I didn't write anything for 5 years. So I finally kind of got back with a lot of encouragement from my daughter to get going and write this thing up and get it going. So it probably could have been longer and worked on it, but I wanted this sucker off my desk. You know, it's been there long enough. And so that was about it. So I'm going to kind of wrap up so we can just have questions, and you guys can go back and look at the books if you would like to, and I hope you do. They are for sale, by the way. And also my other books are there. The other 8 books are there in case you find some of those interesting. I wanted to say one more thing. Because of you back here, I was talking to my friendly mailman person there. He works in the post office, and we got to talking when I'm mailing a book, and he said, boy, I really like history, but there isn't anybody to talk history about around here. And I thought, you know what, and I've talked to Colin about it, is we think we're going to put together a history group, a library history group, with the idea once a month we come together, pick a subject for the next month. We'll all check out books based on that subject and come back and discuss that subject based on the books we've written. So if any of you happen to find that idea intriguing, please visit with me, and maybe we can get it going some, because it's just fun to study history through something besides textbooks, and work on that. So any questions now?
Well, I do, because I've been wanting to know this. So in the book, you touch on a little bit about slavery, about Indian slavery, not just African slavery. You touch on women, like mail order women.
Yeah.
And how much of that is true to the Rathburns, and how much did you just put in there so you could talk about it?
Okay, most of it is true. Slavery kind of got started in this country, kind of, and you'll find it in the book, even though I don't really point it out, but you'll find out this indentured servant idea. First was the indentured servants. We got used to indentured servants. That was normally a 10-year indenture you had to spend, and we had that. And then we came across, because there weren't any wives. I keep pointing here like that was New England, but in New England there were very few women. And when a woman died and she had a family, that man wasn't hurt. He didn't know how to change diapers. He didn't know how to milk a cow. He didn't even know how to make his own breakfast. So he had to have a woman in the house to even survive. So the ship captains I kind of ran about that accidentally. Ship captains got the idea. They would bring women over, many of them of rather sketchy backgrounds, and they would bring them over and actually either sell them or auction them off and help pay for their trip. So they had to pay for that, because they were hauling people over, but there was nothing to haul back. So they didn't have a good trade going, so they had to make some money coming in. So we had women they had to sign an agreement that if they left that man within so many years, and it always varied, so many years, they had to pay him back for their trip over. And of course, they didn't have any money, so they were literally slaves. So we were kind of used to that idea. When they moved out onto the island, and it started in really among the Pilgrims even, they started making Native Americans indentured servants. Those people didn't know they were becoming indentured servants. They thought they were just getting some money to do some work, but then they found out they were basically indentured servants. And then when they got down here, you'll see how John started using indentured servants. That is true. He did have them. Then they became slaves. Many, many Native Americans were used in slavery, all up and down in America. So when it came to black slavery, it was an easy transition. They already had gotten used to using this cheaper labor source, and now that was dying off because the Native Americans didn't take too well to slavery, because they didn't know the kind of work they were doing, and they didn't know how to do it, and they didn't know the foods, and it was always a mess. Whereas the blacks had been known for slavery in Africa for many, many, many years, and so when they came over, they became much more better labor. Now that's pretty cold, isn't it? But that's the truth. That's the way they used them. And so they go. And even John, he eventually was approached to help build the Long Wharf in Newport, which still exists. And they wanted the Long Wharf because they wanted to attract the tri-trade away from Boston. The tri-trade was that ships would leave and go to Africa and they would get slaves. They would come to the islands, and they would sell almost all their slaves, and they would pick up molasses, and they brought it back to Boston, and they made rum that then was taken back again in the trade. So it's called the tri-trade. Well, in Newport, the Nagasut Bay is a much better harbor than Boston has. So they were trying to take that trade away, Newport was, from Boston. And they would get this long one. Well, John politically was kicked out because changes of kings. When King James came, he supported King James. Well, King James wasn't there long. And when he got kicked out, then John had to flee out of Newport and go back to the island, because all those political, and that all had to do with religion. James wanted to make England Catholic again, and he also supported making one big colony. And when he eliminated all of the charters for the New England, they had to make new charters. And while it was being done, he appointed a jury of 12 men to run all of Rhode Island. John was one of those jurymen. So here's this guy, I mean, a nobody, was actually running the colony for a while and had that support. So this guy became the real American. So that's slavery. When I say I made it up, I don't know that his brother-in-law, who had become Quaker, he came over with him, and he became Quaker later, and I didn't know that where he got his wife. I couldn't figure it out, because I knew this Quaker wouldn't get a Puritan wife, and there was nothing but Puritans available. So where in the heck did he get a wife? I also know she wasn't Native American, because we have the records of her and everything. And so then it was right then when I discovered these wives coming over. So I had him actually go to 2 different boatloads to try to get a wife, and showed 2 different ways they sell it. Now the way they did that was pretty close. I mean, I don't know the actual conversations that went on and all that and the personalities, but those were true in there. And it is true that John did get a black slave. He had one. We know that because when he died, they have to make a full inventory of his property, everything he owned. I know how many spoons he had, and of property. And then the town council does that to make sure that all the children get something. They were so worried about the law of primogeniture, they didn't want that to happen here. So they made sure that the family was treated right. So we know that, and in that he had a slave, and he gave that slave to his wife, who was to keep him for 10 years, and when he left, he was to get a suit of clothes and sent on his way. So they did take care of him. I mean, they gave him a suit of clothes. And so that's all in the records. So I tried really to handle. I do about an hour of research per page. As Christine knows, we went back to Rhode Island area many times and walked the land. I'm one of the lucky guys who've been on every gravesite for the 9 generations. I've been there. I've been almost in all the land. There's one or 2 pieces of land I haven't seen yet coming across, and as I'm writing. Right now I'm writing about the part of the family that came through Wisconsin, and so I'm writing that right now. Any other questions? Huh? No, we're not from Wisconsin. And when I came here, I knew nothing of my family, and it turned out we lived 4 miles from the family farm when they came here, and that they got married in the town I was in. And since then, I found, the year before last, we went down to Reedsburg area, and I heard that they had the family mill, a sawmill was there. I knew there was a barn there, and I took Bev down to see the barn, and we asked where did you think the mill was, and they said, oh, it's up the stream a little ways, and I think there's some old equipment up for there somewhere in the weeds, but I've never seen it. So we thought we'd walk up there and see, so we got back up there, and there was sitting the water wheel. It's still sitting there, the big water, it's a turbine more than a water wheel, a metal water turbine that's still there, sitting there. So that's kind of the luck of that. I'm going to have to quit because, you know, the library closes at 8, folks. So I'll still be here to answer questions. I'll come on down and please go back and look at the books. And thank you very much for coming. No, very good job. Sorry.